Bienvenidos, Ushamdid, and welcome Anne Arundel Community College learners from the CTS-233 Fall 2021 semester. This is the Cisco Networking Academy's DevNet Associate course curriculum, or the DevASC course curriculum. And in this supplemental Linux command line basics tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at file descriptors and how we can leverage those to do redirection on the command line. So let's go ahead and jump on to our Ubuntu virtual machine. And as you can see here, I am on the command line. So the first thing that we need to sort out is what are the file descriptors? Well, there's 3 of them that we are interested in. Now, there are more than 3 or can be more than 3. However, there's 3 that we're interested in. And the first is going to be file descriptor 0, or just FD0. Now, FD0 is standard input, right? And so what is standard input? Well, standard input is me typing things into the terminal window here from the keyboard. In other words, the shell which I am running, and if I type PS, which is going to show you the processes I'm running here, you can see we've got a couple terms here. We've got TTY, and that's kind of the terminal. Now, PTS is a pseudo terminal, right? That kind of spawned from, think of it as like a virtual terminal that we're using here. And that's PTS, the pseudo terminal. And you can see that the bash process, right, has a process ID of 2051. And so this is the sort of virtual terminal that's been started up so that I can run my command line session using the born again shell, or the bash shell. And again, the pseudo terminal falls under that main sort of physical terminal, if you will, that you would have, or the native terminal is probably a better way to say it, either through hardware or the kernel, right? So the input that I'm typing, the standard input, is what I'm typing in. Now, standard input can also come from different places, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So the next file descriptor is file descriptor 1, or I'm just typing FD1 here, right? And file descriptor 1 is standard output. Well, where does standard output go? Well, by default, just like standard input comes from this keyboard here and it shows up on my terminal screen, standard output also shows up by default on the terminal screen. And so what's an example of that? Well, PS, there I am providing the standard input, or stdin, as it's commonly abbreviated, and I hit enter, and there is the stdout, or standard output. And you can see by default, both of those take place on the terminal line. Now, what if the standard input is a whole bunch of junk here, right? And I hit enter, what do we see? Well, this is not the standard output. This is an error. So here we're seeing file descriptor 2. So again, file descriptor 0 is standard input, file descriptor 1 is standard output, and file descriptor 2 is standard error. And as we've noticed, these all, by default, deal with the terminal with which I'm working. So what if I don't want to see the error messages? Or what if I want to redirect the output? How can we work with standard in, standard out, and standard error? Well, there's certain ways that we can do that. And now we're going to sort of dig into redirection, because that's typically when we're working with any of the file descriptors. And it's no mistake that these are referred to as file descriptors. Remember, we talked about Linux. It looks at everything as if it's a file. So it should be no surprise that when we talk about standard in, standard out, and standard error, that they're commonly referred to as file descriptors. Or I should say they are referred to as file descriptors. but they're typically referred to as FD0, FD1, FD2. So the first thing we're going to do is let's redirect standard output. So when I type the PS command, there's a standard input. There's my standard output. Well, what if I don't want to see the standard output? I can redirect file descriptor 1 and use the greater than sign. And I want you to, and I'm going to show you some different ways we can do this, because if you've seen some of this before, you might be saying, hey, wait a minute, you don't have to put the 1 there. I'm going to get to that. So here I'm saying redirect, right? And that arrow, think of it as pointing, right, to another direction. So I'm going to put that in this file that I'm going to create called junk. So when I say PS, oh, sorry, we already have a directory named junk. So we're going to have to come up with something better. We'll just call it junk PS, right? So what I'm doing here is this is my standard input. But in the standard input, I'm telling the shell, the bash shell, that for file descriptor 1, send it into this file, junk PS. And I hit enter, and you'll notice we don't see the standard output. We don't see file descriptor 1 because I've told the shell, hey, take file descriptor 1 and send it to junk PS, to the file junk PS. So if I was to cat junk PS, sure enough, there's the output, the standard out that we would typically see on our terminal, right? That pseudo terminal, or PTY, or PTS line, right? We've told the shell to redirect standard output. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, what if you were to put in that bogus command that you ran before, right? Like all those letters that we had there, and hit enter. Well, take a look at what happened here. We still see the error, the standard error, because is standard error file descriptor 1? And that's why I'm kind of using the 1 here. And the answer to that question is no. It doesn't redirect the error into that file. We still see file descriptor 2 come to the pseudo terminal here because we only told the bash shell to redirect standard output. Well, there is no output from this command because that is not a command, right? We're just going to get an error saying command not found. And in fact, if I cat out junk PS, you'll notice that there's nothing there. And this leads us, again, this is going to lead us into another conversation because you might be saying, well, wait a second, a minute ago, you did cat junk PS and the standard output from PS was in there. And if we ran that command again, PS1 greater than, right, redirect the standard output that results from running the PS command into junk PS, and then we cat junk PS, we're going to see that. There it is. There's the standard output. But for some reason, when I went to redirect the output from some bogus command, right, we see the standard error that doesn't get sent into the junk PS file, and junk PS is gone. So let's unpack a couple of things that we're seeing here. The first is when I run this command, PS1 greater than junk PS, I'm telling the shell, send the standard output instead of the default of sending it to the screen here, the terminal. I want you to redirect it. That's the redirection symbol. This is the file descriptor that I want to redirect. And so I want to redirect standard output, which by default comes to the terminal. I'm redirecting it into the file junk PS. And as we saw, it does that. But redirection can be tricky because when you say greater than, when you say redirect, if the file does not exist, it will create it. If the file does exist, it will overwrite the file. And that is what we're seeing here. And this also gives us some insight into the order of operations. What happens first? Does it run the bogus command first and then open the file for writing? And the answer is no. It's going to open the file for writing and then run the command. Because what you're seeing is that standard out is being redirected. There is no standard out, but it opens that file up for writing for redirection and overwrites it because that's what the single greater than symbol does. So this begs the question, well, hold on, then how do you add to the file? How do you not wipe it out? What if I want to append to the file? And we can do that as well. So right now, if I was to say we'll say PS, and we're going to say 1 greater than junk PS. So we're redirecting the standard output, what the program PS would normally send to the terminal window. We're redirecting that, the standard out, into the file junk PS. And lo and behold, there is the standard output. It's been redirected into this file. But what if I want to add to the file? I don't want to delete it. Well, I can say, let's run the date command, and I can say send the standard output from the date command, but not redirect in terms of overwriting it, append to the end of junk PS. And we can do that with 2 greater than symbols. So now when I say cat junk PS, we have the standard out that was redirected from the PS command, showing us our processes we're running. And now we've added the output of the date command. We've appended the output of the date command to the end of this file. And so again, this is a key takeaway. When you're doing redirection, the single greater than symbol, if the file exists, will open the file for writing and overwrite whatever is in there, even if it doesn't put anything in there. And that's what you saw right here, right? We run this bogus command that produces no standard output. It produces a standard error, which is file descriptor 2. So it produces no standard output, which is file descriptor 1, yet it wipes that file out. And you saw that right here. If you want to avoid that, you can use the greater than, which is going to append to the end of the file. So you might be asking the question, okay, well, if you can do that with file descriptor 1, can you avoid having errors come to, or I should say standard error, come to the terminal and redirect standard error? And the answer is absolutely. But let's take a look at 2 different ways we can do this. So if I put in this bogus command right here, and I say 1 greater than, and I send it into junk PS, what is going to be the result of this command? Exactly. What we're going to see is I want to say 2. What we're going to see is the standard error, file descriptor 2, is going to be placed into junk PS, but the shell, the bash shell, because we've used a single greater than symbol, will open the file junk PS for writing. It will overwrite. It's going to get rid of everything in there. And the only thing that's going to be in there now is this error. The name of the program we thought we were running, which is just bogus. So we're going to see this : space command not found. How can we check that? Well, let's cat junk PS. And there it is. And that's all that's in the file because we use the single greater than symbol to redirect the output, or I should say the standard error output, which we would typically see by default come to the terminal. We've said, no, I want file descriptor 2 to be redirected into the file junk PS. Now, let's take a step back and let's unpack a few things here. So I've used file descriptor 1. When I say 1 greater than, I've used file descriptor 1 to say 1 greater than when I want to overwrite and redirect, or redirect and append. And I've used file descriptor number 2. So you might be asking, okay, well, what do you have to use the numbers? What's the default? Well, when you're doing redirection of standard out and standard err, the default is for standard output. So all this time I've been saying 1 greater than, you don't have to put the 1. In other words, I could do the following. Let's say PS greater than junk PS. And that is basically redirecting and overwriting the file if it exists. If it doesn't exist, it's going to create it from scratch, and it's going to put that output, in junk PS. So again, for redirecting standard out, we don't have to put the number there. For standard err, we do have to put the number there. So I put a bogus command, and let's say 2 greater than junk PS. So I'm doing redirection, but I'm appending the output to the end of the junk PS file. And so when I say cat junk PS, there is the standard output that we got from the PS command, and here is the error that we got from this bogus command. But again, we get it because we're appending. So now the question is, well, can you keep appending things? Well, sure. If I was to use a different bogus command and then say 2 greater than junk PS, and then we say cat junk PS, now we get this other error. If I was to do, and it's not just with standard error, what if I was to say cat etc hosts greater than junk PS? So I've redirected the standard output. And what would the standard output normally be? Well, it would be the output of concatenating the etc hosts file to the screen. And here's your standard out. By default, it comes to the terminal when not redirected. So when I say cat junk PS, now we see I did a single redirect here. It overwrote the file that was here, and it puts in here the output of the etc hosts file. So you can see single greater than sign, it's going to wipe the file out if it exists. So if I said PS greater than junk PS, now when we cat junk PS, all you see is the output from PS. Now, if I wanted to keep that and the cat etc hosts and append it to junk PS, we can do that. So if we cat junk PS, we have the output from the standard out from the PS command and the standard out from concatenating the etc hosts file. And this is a great way to make copies of files sometimes, or to shove the standard output or the standard error down what I like to refer to as a pipeline, something that we'll talk about later when we get into grep and awk and sed. So we've looked at file descriptor 1, we've looked at file descriptor 2, and you might be saying, well, that's great, right? And that works for these little errors, but what's a more realistic application of this redirection? And I'm going to introduce you now to dev null. And what dev null is it's a black hole. And that's exactly what I want you to think of it as. Anything that gets sent to dev null is gone forever. There is no getting it back. So one of the commands I typically find myself using, no pun intended, is the find command. If I'm looking for something on the file system that has a name, and let's say the name is Python 3, right? Now watch what happens here when I say, and again, sort of the English translation is, hey, bash shell, I want you to find for me, starting at the top root directory, any file with the name Python 3, and it's going to print that out to standard out. And you can see here, as it's continuing to move, and good, it finished up quickly. You can see here, there's some standard output, right? It came to my terminal. But what do we get? Well, we get all these permission denied errors. Because when you're looking into directories that you are trying to look into directories that you don't have permissions to look in, it's going to tell you permission denied. So for example, if I tried to say ls etc SSL / private, which is this last error that we got here, I just want to sort of isolate that. Take a look at what happens. It says, well, you can't open that directory. You don't have permissions. You get the permission denied. So my challenge to you is, using redirection, how could I ensure that I only see the standard output, that I don't see the standard error? Well, let's recall that command. So find for me, starting from the top of the file system hierarchy, any file that has the Python 3 string, that literal string in it, Python 3, and I want you to print it to standard output, right? Because we want to see what the result is. I don't want to see the errors. So I can put these in a file in temp called /temp/errors. Now, again, if that file doesn't exist, it will automatically be created for me. If it did exist, anything in that file is gone. But the difference is I only see the valid output. And by valid, I'm defining valid here as meaning I want to see all the directory, or I want to see all the locations where Python 3 exists. I don't need to see all those error messages because that just kind of like mucks everything up for me. So here we see what we're looking to see. Well, let me go ahead and cat /temp/errors. And let's see what's in there. Well, lo and behold, here are all of the errors. So what we've seen with that command right there is I can separate and segregate standard output, letting it go to its default location. And I can grab standard error and say, no, you're going somewhere else. You're, in this case, /temp/errors. Now, if I don't want to keep the errors, and typically when I'm running this command, I could care less about the error messages. This is where dev null comes into play. And again, what is dev null? Well, dev null is nothing more than a black hole. And things that you send into dev null are gone forever. So if I run this command, we get the standard output, file descriptor 1, to the screen, right? And that works out great. So I don't get any error messages. However, the error messages went into dev null. And let's see what happens if I try to cat /dev/null. Yeah, nothing there, right? It's a black hole. So be careful when you do this, because what you wouldn't want to do is run the following command, is to say, oh yeah, send the standard output for what I'm looking for, and look what happened. Did we see any successful finds of Python 3? Are any of those displayed here? And the answer is pretty obvious. No, all you're getting are these permission denied errors, because what did you do? Well, and let's see how far back this is going to go. I was hoping it wasn't going to go this far back. And let's just do this, clear the screen. What we did was we said, send the standard output, redirect that to dev null. So redirect what I want to see to dev null. That's not good, right? Now, if you wanted to keep the output, what could you do? Yeah, I could send it into temp and then, you know, where Python 3 lives, right? And we run that. We still see the standard error. And this is why I'm kind of walking us up to something here. And so we still see the standard error. But if I was to say cat /temp/ where Python live, or Python 3 lives, right? There are all of the standard out successes where it went into directories it had permissions to and was able to find Python 3, right? That string Python 3. And so this works out great. The problem is what did we get to the screen? We got all the standard error. So now the question is, well, what if I wanted to work with both standard out and standard err. Can I manipulate both of those? Well, the answer is yes, and we can combine by using the ampersand character. So remember, if I'm working with standard error, I have to use that number 2. Very important, because that is how that file descriptor is identified. It's not the default. So what if I was to run that find command and I wanted to send standard output and standard error to the same location? Well, you would say send the standard error to the same spot as standard out. So the 2 greater than ampersand 1. Now, what is this going to do? So let's do this. We'll start with, let me pull the file name back first and we'll kind of walk our way up to this. Sorry, 2 greater than ampersand 1. Now, you have to have the 1 there, right? And, well, actually, correction. Let's walk through this. So 2 greater than ampersand 1. What exactly is that saying? It's saying send standard error file descriptor 2 to the same location as file descriptor 1. And where is file descriptor 1 going? By default, it's going to the screen. So really, that command right there would have been the same as this, right? There's no difference, because if you're saying send standard error to the same location that standard out is going to, well, that's not going to make that big of a difference, because by default, where do they both go? They both go to the terminal. So can I reverse this? What if I wanted to say send standard out to the same location as standard error? And the answer is yes, because look, we're getting the successes. Standard output, which are these successes, is going to the same location as standard error, which by default is the terminal, right? So we see both of those. So let's clear the screen. Let's pull back this first one here. Now, what if I say greater than, and we'll say temp and new file. And then I put 2 greater than ampersand 1. So what's going to happen here, right? I'm saying send standard error to the same place as standard out. And we're redirecting standard out into temp new file. What's going to happen there? Well, let's hit enter. And you'll notice that both standard out and standard error, based on our standard input that we typed in here, nothing showed up. So where did it go? Well, let's cat slash, or we'll do a more on slash temp slash new file. And what happened? What do you see here? We've got everything. We captured with that command. We basically said, yeah, send the standard out into temp new file. And hey, send standard error to the same place that standard out's going, right? For whatever reason, we just decided that's what we wanted to do. Now, what if that's not what we wanted to do? So I hit enter there so we can have it run. What if I wanted to send standard out into that file, but send standard error to dev null? We can do that too. So now let's cat slash temp slash new file. And what's in here? Only standard out. Because we told the bash shell, I want you to run this command. I want you to take the standard out and put it in the temp new file. I want you to take the error messages and just dump them. Get rid of them. I want them gone, right? Now, you might be wondering, okay, well, that's great, but when would I do this? Well, one example is what I just gave you right here, is when you want to capture the standard output, but you only want the legitimate standard output. The error messages you're not interested in, right? And so now let's talk a little bit about file descriptor 0, because we kind of glazed over and ignored file descriptor 0. So can you redirect standard input? And let me give you one of the examples you'll typically see, which you should immediately say, wait a minute, that doesn't make much sense to me. So let's look at cat, the concatenate command. Remember, I can say cat/temp/new file. And what does that do? Well, here's my standard input that I'm providing via the keyboard to the terminal saying, run this command. And we see standard output. Well, you could also redirect what the concatenate command is working with. And that command right there, you should say, wait a second, do I even need that? Why would I want to redirect? Oops, sorry. And I wanted to put some spaces in there. Let's clear the screen. We'll rerun that again. Because you'll see, what does it do? It does the exact same thing that the cat/temp/new file does, except we're using this less than, right? So this is how we deal with file descriptor 0, is when we're doing the less than symbol. And what that means is redirect standard input from some other source, right here it's going to be this file, into that command. And again, you should immediately be looking at that and say, well, wait a second, I don't need to put the less than symbol in there. And what's the default for redirection on standard in? It's 0, because what could I have said? Yeah, I could have said redirect. And here's the thing. When we did the 1, we put it in front, right? What happens if I put it in front? Well, it works. What happens if I put it behind? Yeah, you can see here, it looks at reading it as redirect standard input, and it thinks that the 0 is the input. And you can see it comes back and says, yeah, there's no file or directory 0 here, right? So there's nothing I'm going to be able to do. In fact, watch this. If I was to say cat etc hosts, and we're going to redirect that into temp 0, now let's see what happens when we run that command. And this is going to prove to you that the shell says, okay, we're going to concatenate something. Where's my standard input coming from? Well, it's being redirected, and it's going to come from that file. And I'll leave the temp new file up there. And you can see it comes back and says, no such file or directory. If I take off temp new file, it still says no such file or, I'm sorry, I wanted to do that in the current working directory. I apologize. I redirected into temp 0. Let's just do this. There we go. So now when I say cat <0, and even if I left up the temp new file, right, it's going to concatenate both files. And again, let me scroll back up here. You can see that it took it, or actually it took it as I was anticipating we were going to get. Maybe it's going to be if I do. There we go. So when I put the 0 after the less than sign, and again, these are sort of like, you could classify these as stupid Linux tricks. However, there is some practicality here that it goes to do the cat of that file and it works here, but do we see the etc hosts file when I added temp new file? No, the etc host file didn't end up in here, right? That file 0. So when you're working with file descriptor 0, if it's followed by a file name that is legitimate, the 0 could be on either side, right? And we saw that. I could say 0, I'm sorry, could say 0 less than, and we get what we're expecting here, right? Just the output from new file, or we could say less than 0, and it treats it equally, right? It sort of treats it as, oh, you mean file descriptor 0. But when we do this, it doesn't treat it as file descriptor 0. It's looking for the name of a file, right? And so there may be instances where that is something that you're interested in doing. And so we've covered quite a bit of ground here with respect to the file descriptor. File descriptor 0 is standard in. File descriptor 1 is standard out. File descriptor 2 is standard err. We looked at redirection. We saw the greater than and then the greater than, remembering that the greater than, if the file exists, it will overwrite the file. And I should say, technically, if the file exists and you have permissions to modify that file, it will overwrite that file. If you use the greater than, it will simply append whatever the standard output is to the end of the file. And we saw how we could then say, well, wait, what about standard error? And we can redirect and append standard error if we wanted to, simply by saying to greater than. And when you wanted to send standard error to the same location as standard output, you would say to greater than &1, and that would actually do exactly what you wanted it to do. Oh, and you know what? I just remembered. In fact, I just remembered. So here's another way that you could say that to greater than &1, which is basically send standard error and standard out to the same location. If I was to say cat/temp/new file, right? We see this. If I was to say, what is it? Let's say cat/temp/new file, and it's &greater than, I think. And we probably want to do this where we have some errors. And I say dev null, right? Or we could say, if you type in cal, you can see the calendar for the month, right? So if I say cal, and then I say, and we want some kind of an error here. So I'm going to say &greater than /dev/null. That is the same as saying, whoops, pull this back. That is the same as saying to, or if I was to say that command and then redirect the output to dev null, whatever output we would get to standard out, and then say to greater than &1, that is the same as the command that is directly above it. And I'm trying to think this through, because typically I don't use the &greater than, but it just occurred to me that these are actually the same. In fact, if we say cal and I say &greater than /dev/null, standard out and standard error would go to dev null, and that should be the same as cal, and we'll say we're going to redirect standard out to dev null, but we're also sending standard error to dev null. And again, just a different way, the to greater than &1, a different way to do the same thing. And I had totally forgotten about this sort of like shorthand of doing this. So again, that is going to wrap up our file descriptor and redirection Linux command line basics tutorial. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.